السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء. Why don't you come up here, inshallah. So, inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to try to make this short and sweet. It's usually when you're crammed at the end for time, it's easier to make a promise that inshallah ta'ala I'm going to try to make it as short as possible. Oh, cameraman's like, no. Well, I mean, I'm sure everyone is fatigued, at least physically, hopefully not mentally, but inshallah ta'ala, I think that a lot of what I wanted to present has already been discussed. Partially what was like an epistemological discussion of how we approach different issues. The Islamic scholars, for example, are primarily trained in accessing and interpreting transmitted knowledge, and that requires a reflection on the past. Whereas empirical knowledge, if you look at mental health specialists, they're obviously basing most of their research and their understanding of the psyche based upon empirical data and observation. And these are two things that are not necessarily at odds with one another. But this was something I think that Humayun had already discussed, so I don't want to get into that again. So we already had like a discussion of the history, right? A historical perspective that Dr. Rani provided, and then we had a theoretical discussion. Right now, Shaykh Rami and I wanted to discuss, really just practically speaking, what takes place in the Khalil Center, in this spiritual wellness and mental wellness center, in order to integrate traditional Islamic learning with modern psychology. So there are various stages, and to be very honest, we're in the initial stages of the development of our models, right? Because it hasn't been a very long time since we've, as an institution, developed and established ourselves, and then also been able to sort of take the time out in order to do research, in order to develop a system for collaboration between scholars of Islamic law, between theologians, and also mental health experts. So the first thing that really actually began this whole process was communication. So I usually break it down into three stages. There's communication, appreciation, education. The whole idea of Khalil Center came about as a result of the communication of some traditionally trained scholars and also mental health experts. And that communication was quite important. It was informal initially, and then it became formalized. And part of that continues in the form of our advisory board and our board of trustees, many of whom are in front of you today. So you have this diverse group of mental health experts, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, academic psychologists, scholars of Islamic law, scholars of different schools of Islamic law, with also background in educational psychology or applied behavioral sciences. So that diversity really helps us. So when we have discussions, those are discussions that are hopefully enriched by that diversity. And I'm sure at Shaykh Rami's dinner table, there's a lot more of that taking place beyond the formal setting. But actually, the informal settings, and this is one of the advantages that we have in our California branch, that we have, mashallah, a sort of a cluster of individuals who live in close proximity and also in the same household, who are able to discuss these issues and communicate very easily, and that works to our advantage. The second thing is the formal consultations. So I know we still, and our families probably complain about this a lot, Human's family and my own, we do a lot of consultation over the phone, in person, after maybe having a consultation or a session with a client. We'll sit down and we'll discuss certain issues. And these are very important because number one is it's communication, right? So like this OCD issue, myself and Human have discussed this in the past, that what we were trained in, try to understand how, and it was effective. I saw an effective treatment sometimes of certain individuals when they were studying Kitab al-Tahara, and there would be not 45-minute wudu, but there's like a 3, 4, 5-minute wudu starting, and the teacher immediately starts to be cognizant of that, aware of it, and try to point that out. So it was interesting. I had these discussions with Human informally, but we also tried to make that formal, and I'll talk a little about that inshallah ta'ala. Imam convenings. So we have sort of these convenings. I always tell Human that sounds like a horror novel, the convening. But the Imam convenings is basically like a sort of a discussion forum for imams to sit with Khalil Center's mental health specialists and try to discuss what they're dealing with in the community, and to offer our services, to let them know that if there are cases, or even to let them know what the legal implications of treating someone who may be suicidal would be if they didn't have the training and they didn't defer to an expert. And we've had that throughout the city of Chicago, and that was very important for just establishing our base, to help gain an appreciation from the scholar's perspective of what services there are that are available in the community. That's part of also our leadership outreach initiative. And then we do cooperative research. So myself and Human, Dr. Rani and Human, and mashallah also there are more individuals who are co-authoring papers in forensic psychiatry, OCD, schizophrenia, and looking at things from both the perspective of the Islamic tradition and also modern psychology. That leads to appreciation, right? So when we have these discussions, both the mental health experts begins to appreciate what Dr. Rani spoke about, like the rich tradition and what has already been done, and that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But the Islamic scholar, he begins to appreciate also, what they're lacking in and what their sort of boundaries are and their limitations. And that has led us to develop formal education programs for training both the scholars of Islamic law, or ulama training, but also therapist training. The ulama are trained, we have a variety of programs that we offer. Part of that is Dr. Human's 2-week chaplaincy intensive. He holds that at Hartford Seminary, also online. We also have this Muslim mental health first responder certification that we've done in 4 locations, and over 150 imams have participated. Community workshops, we regularly do community workshops for the general community, but also for scholars. And then undergraduate and graduate internships. So we have scholars, or students of knowledge who are studying in seminaries, in madrasas, or Islamic universities. One in particular actually was from last year, is here, and actually the family of another who's currently with it. They're sitting here as well, mashallah, current intern who's actually studying Islamic law in an advanced level, and also interning and helping with the research, being assisting in research in various things, and also kind of just shadowing the religious consultants. And then therapist training, we have clinical graduate internships, affiliation with Islamic colleges. We offer therapists an opportunity to study formally Islamic studies, Arabic, Islamic law, aqidah, etc. We have personal and spiritual development mandates, and then we're trying to develop sort of a requirement for all therapists to do some training in Islamic studies, to understand the basic, epistemology, theology, and to appreciate, even if they don't become masters of the law of theology, but to appreciate the depth of what is available. I'm gonna skip this and this as well. Maybe I kind of just really briefly talk about how we would go about using a traditional legal theoretical framework to handle a modern issue. So if you look at how Imam Ghazali and others talk about the extraction, refinement, and actualization of what we call the manat in Arabic, the legally applicable factor or the pivot. In every issue, and in the beginning, the first slide, I didn't talk about it, but there are a lot of issues that are not necessarily what we call mansus alayh, explicitly discussed in the texts. There's a need for ijtihad, the derivation of a ruling based upon precedent. And in order to do that, there are several processes, right? The first is actually to extract the legally applicable criteria. What is legally applicable to this particular person's case? We call that takhrij al-manat, and that's the realm prerogative of the jurist, of the faqih. Then to refine what they call the tanqih al-manat, the refinement of the legally applicable criterion, that is also the role of the jurist. But then the application and actualization, which I'll give you a case study so that will make it clear what I'm referring to here, to actually be able to actualize that legally applicable factor, that requires the contribution of a specialist. And to kind of bring this home, I'm going to give you a case study. This was one of the early cases in which we had some formal collaboration between myself and one of the therapists in the Chicago branch. And that was a case of a client who the therapist diagnosed them with PTSD. It may have been a previous diagnosis, but it was in the history. And that's one of the advantages that imams really, myself, I can appreciate that. I know Shaykh Rami can appreciate it. That if you're handling a case, right, if you're like an imam in the masjid, and after salah someone comes up to you and they have a question about something that potentially could be OCD, but you have no idea because you have no background. Having that background and being referred to by a therapist or by someone who has some history of that client is really helpful. right? It provides context that helps us understand that maybe perhaps I should have multiple sessions. Imams have this problem; they have a hard time saying no. They need, if they're forced to give an answer right away, they have to give it right away. You can't tell a person that let's have another sit down, let's communicate, let me give me a little background. They just know, is it a jinn or is it not a jinn? Is it magic or is it not magic? So the advantage of having this kind of collaboration is that we can say, well, let me look at your history. Let's have a second session, and in that time, you can have a meeting with the therapist to talk about what they understand is the person's condition. So the client was diagnosed with PTSD, generalized anxiety, and depression, and they were on currently medications. The background is that they were married, a convert to Islam. They had been a Muslim for 4 years. They had negative experiences with religious legal consultation that had to do a lot with the marriage and the particular individual that the husband was referring to for advice on marriage. So there was a suspicion that the scholar would not give a recommendation that would be sensitive to the scenario at hand and that particular woman's condition, even though she had been divorced. She essentially at this point, she was married, but then this is now a year later, so she's now divorced. She complained of dizziness and fainting when fasting, increased anxiety the last 2 years when fasting. Anti-anxiety medication increases difficulty in waking for pre-fast meal, the suhoor. This is all stuff, information that was gathered before I was consulted. Intermittent and unpredictable back pain was also a complaint. Now the therapist couldn't verify that, but that was part of the the reporting of the client. And she was recently in a car accident, which was adding to her physical and psychological symptoms. Now the counselor mentioned these concerns, right? So we had a communication. This was actually initially online, and her concern was that studies actually do describe that fasting enhances mood and vigilance, meaning by fasting, the study mentioned that no food, just liquids or simple fruits for 2 to 7 days. So it didn't exactly fit. So she had some confusion as to whether or not she could apply this study to what the Sawm or the Islamic fast. This certainly doesn't mimic the Ramadan fasting exactly, but she was hesitant to say that you should not fast based upon your conditions because she said the data seems to indicate potentially the opposite. Only one study she was able to find, because this is when she communicated initially with Human about this. Human requested her to do some research and to see whether or not there is any data to indicate that in severe depression cases or PTSD that fasting would be detrimental to their mental condition. And she was only able to discover one study, which fasting in depressed clients, but noted the depression. Only one study referred to Ramadan, in which fasting in depressed clients, but noted their depression was very low to start with, and they started restricting intake 3 months before. So it was difficult to use that data, right, on someone who had, in this case, severe symptoms. The counsel also reported potential bias with convert clients. This was her concern, that she felt that as a counselor, she might be biased towards a convert because there tends to be a general, a flexibility that is desired with converts, and that's oftentimes not appreciated, right, because the convert doesn't want to be given the easiest answer always, and they kind of feel that they're being talked down to. So she had this concern that maybe I have this bias in speaking with her, and I don't want to give her an immediate dispensation without consultation. Yes, and then from the client's prior reports and her pre-existing condition, the counselor believed that it was obvious that, in her understanding, that fasting physiologically and psychologically triggers some of her symptoms and increases her suffering. And she knew this because she had been in sessions with her for several weeks in the month of Ramadan. So she agreed that the symptoms were real for the patient, for the client, I should say. And she said that I cannot verify if the physical element of that is true or not, but she says that she does report it to be real, and therefore her recommendation was to consider it to be real. And she wasn't sure, however, if fasting is the direct cause of the heightened level of symptoms in Ramadan. Throughout the year, the client's symptoms fluctuate. However, from her past experience in 2 previous Ramadans, her symptoms got worse with fasting. And she said, this is her words, I am a little hesitant on why or how this is connected to fasting. She had received this fatwa in 2014 to not fast, to give a kafara of $300 to feed the poor, and she considered herself poor and was on the zakat program, so she couldn't afford to give the kafara. So this was the case. Like, this is practically speaking all the data that was given to me in the consultation, and then I actually, in this particular case, consulted with another scholar who had more expertise in Islamic law, and I'm going to try to simplify the process that we went through in order to come up with a conclusion, right?
What's the legal question?
The question was whether the question was whether or not she should fast in Ramadan, or she should. Actually, it was kind of vague. Should she fast? If she doesn't fast, what should she do in order to make up for it? The kafara, the question. She had a question about the kafara. Is that a good fatwa? Is that She didn't give the name of the mufti who gave her that fatwa. It turned out not to be a mufti at all, just some untrained imam of masjid. But that was the claim. So if you look at the process of tanqih al-manat, identification of what would be a legally applicable factor, just grossly simplify. Being a new Muslim, does that have anything to do with it? Obviously not. Her marriage, it could, right? Actually, a lot of what she was dealing with had to do with trauma that she experienced through her marriage. Is there an element of physical or mental harm, or is it mental incapacity, right, from depression or anxiety? And if there's dispensation to not fast, which of these factors comes into play? So obviously the jurist is sorting through all of these factors, right? And then has to also take into consideration what is significant harm, right? What we call darar in Islamic law. Is there, for example, loss of life or limb, or exacerbation or elongation of the illness? So this was also something that had to be taken into consideration, and that required actually a second consultation with the therapist. I had to ask her, do you think that if she fasts, and she had some, she mentioned some of this already in the document, but do you think this will make her illness worse? And then, we discussed the criteria for permissibility. These are essentially the three criteria for dispensation of, dispensation in terms of relieving someone of an obligation, or giving a prohibitive substance in medication, right? Number one, you must prove that there's necessity, which requires the definition of harm. Number two, there must be an absence of permissible alternatives, right? So, for example, she mentioned that she could take medication before suhoor. But the problem was that if she takes the medication before suhoor, she becomes not functional. So she can't function during the day. She becomes so sleepy and she becomes so drowsy that she can't drive and she can't do other things. And so there was a problem. So we resolved that also with the second session with the client. So we wanted to explore whether there were any alternative permissible alternatives for this individual where she could take her medication and also fast. And then we had to be certain of satisfactory knowledge that the treatment would be effective. The conclusion was that, as per the specialist assessment, the physical as well as psychological symptoms appeared severe enough to mandate an exemption from the fast, on the basis of the legal principle of avoidance of harm, which we call darar, until such time that the client recovers and is able to make up for such fasts, etc., etc. But really what was interesting here, I don't know what the rest of the parentheses is, but one of the things that we discovered in the consultation with another legal expert was that the recommendation that she had been given to pay the kafara was actually not mandated for her. And the reason is because if she was to recover, there's no fidya. She would have to make up the fast. She wouldn't actually pay it immediately until she was certain that she would not recover from that illness, in which case then you pay the fidya, or the kafara. The fidya, actually. She was using the word kafara. So there's no kafara that is obligatory, and even what she was calling kafara, which is in Arabic really is the fidya, that would only become mandated if the illness became prolonged without hope for recovery. So now this, obviously, it seems like we've really elongated the whole discussion, but this was the formality with which we took one of the earliest cases that we had. And this is what we're hoping to do with all of our cases in which there's a religious consultation. Oftentimes, it's not even, in this particular case, the client wasn't really that interested in consultation herself. It was the therapist who was, sort of, uneasy about giving an answer. So she consulted. So we actually provide, consultations to therapists, but we also find that a lot of clients, even if they get an answer that is actually quite a clear answer from a therapist, they just don't have itminan, right? They don't have confidence that is religiously justified. So they'll seek a consultation with the imam, and the imam basically, or the sheikh, myself and Shaykh Rami at this point, we can quickly consult with the therapist, get an idea of what the background is. And oftentimes it's simply a process of verifying or confirming that the recommendation of the client. Someone said to me, the sheikh or the therapist said that this is something Islamic or Quranic, and they quoted a hadith, they quoted a verse in our session, and I'm having confusion as to whether or not that was justified, right? And so all they really require is the sheikh to say, yeah, that understanding, that sort of integrated therapy, where that therapist was using a verse and not like interpreting the verse. It's a very clear-cut verse to help to prove a point that this is actually true. And so there's oftentimes it's quite a simple process, but oftentimes it's as complex as this. And we have even more complex cases. This actually case came up again this Ramadan, where this particular individual had another physical condition, and they were asking about whether or not they would have dispensation. And immediately I was thinking that if I just recall that last year I had this person ask me this question, I should just give them the dispensation again. But when I actually consulted with a therapist again, and I found out that actually what she was suffering from before is different. Now she's suffering from something quite different, and the circumstances have changed, the factors have changed, and we can't necessarily now grade it as significant harm. So we had to relook at the case. So this is just one case study. And we're hoping to make this a formal process, that everywhere we have a Khalil Center office, that we have the ability to have religious consultations, and religious scholars consult with both the therapist and the client. With that, I'll kind of open the floor for, inshallah ta'ala, questions and discussions. Jazakumullahu Khayran.